As you know, the autonomic nervous system comes in two components, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. At high school you probably learnt that the sympathetic was the flight or fright response. Basically it's the system that responds to pressures in the environment for an organism. The parasympathetic system is the inverse. It's the system that keeps the basic functions operating at a basal level. The driving central nervous system nuclei for the autonomic nervous system lie in the limbic system, and the limbic system is the oldest part of the brain at its core. So the limbic system sits within the core of the brain. From the limbic system, various outputs then exit to from the limbic system, various outputs exit the central nervous system to actually undertake or to drive the functions of the autonomic nervous system. And as we said, there are outputs for parasympathetic, which come out with the cranial nerves, and down in the sacral region as well. And there are outputs for the sympathetic nervous system that fundamentally come off from the region of the thorax. So the sympathetic come off from the thorax, whereas the parasympathetic come off with some cranial nerves and with some of the sacral nerve. And these outputs, just to tell you which cranial nerves they come off with, it is cranial nerve 3, 7, 9, and our old friend 10. And in fact 10 is the largest parasympathetic nerve in the body, and it migrates down through the neck, through the thorax, and through most of the abdomen. And the lower sacral parasympathetic components run down towards the leg. Whereas the sympathetic come off and form a chain along the thorax region where it comes off the spinal cord and then spreads out up and down from there. Now I've drawn this on one side of the central nervous system. Remember, it is symmetric, so you would see it on both sides. Now it's important also to note that the ganglia, or the first synapse of these systems, is different for sympathetic than parasympathetic. The sympathetic have its ganglia where first order neuron synapses with second order neuron very close to where it comes off the spinal cord. And this is in fact called the sympathetic chain and runs down adjacent to the vertebra through the body. Whereas on the other side, the parasympathetic have its ganglia sitting very close. Again, there are synapses in this ganglia, so it's first order to second order. They sit very close to where the actual action of the parasympathetic fibres is to take place. All of these ganglia have as neurotransmitters acetylcholine. And the difference between parasympathetic ganglia and sympathetic ganglia, there are no differences. They both are acetylcholine. The differences between the system are at the end point neurotransmitter, which for parasympathetic is acetylcholine, whereas for the sympathetic system, the end point is noradrenaline. And that is some of the differentiation between the two systems. So this is the introductory summary to the autonomic nervous system. The core computational activity is within the limbic system. It gets its input, or sensory component, to drive these changes from the sensory system that we've talked about elsewhere. The output of the limbic system is either parasympathetic output through cranial nerves, 3, 7, 9 and 10, or sacral fibres, or sympathetic output that comes out with the thoracic spinal nerves. Let's take a moment now to concentrate on the sympathetic nervous system and understand the wiring from here. The initial fibres come out from the spinal cord and synapse in the sympathetic chain. This sympathetic chain runs up and down adjacent to the vertebra through the thorax region, and actually extends into the neck with 3 ganglia running through the neck. Each ganglia has synapses, and the second order neuron will then head off on its journey. The majority of the sympathetic nervous system is going to send fibres to blood vessels. So let's have a look at how this system is wired up. So we'll draw ourselves some sympathetic output. Oops, we'll just do that again, get the colour right. We've got some sympathetic output from the spinal cord. Now that output may go up and down a series of ganglia, but not far, but then it will synapse within the ganglia to then join the second order neuron. These second order neurons will run out from the ganglia, remembering that these ganglia are all joined together, running up like so to form a chain adjacent to the vertebra of the thoracic region and into the neck. The second order neuron will head off, usually finding their way to nearby blood vessels. And these blood vessels act as the transmission pipes for these sympathetic fibres. They wrap themselves around the blood vessel and follow it on its pathway to then end up supplying structures on that journey. Now this is very important in the head and neck region because as you could imagine, we have a fair distance to go from the ganglia, say in the neck, right to the scalp vascular tree that needs to have sympathetic output. And in fact the output from the ganglia in the neck hitches a ride with the carotid system. Hundreds and hundreds, thousands and thousands of sympathetic fibres wrap themselves around the carotid system. And remembering where the carotid system divides into internal carotid and external carotid, these fibres themselves, bundles of them follow both branches, internal and external carotid artery. Heading up to branch off with every single branch of each of these arterial systems. At the very base of the skull, where the internal carotid artery is just about to enter the carotid canal, a small component of these sympathetic fibres come off the internal carotid artery to run across the base of the skull. This is one of the rare places where you see a sympathetic nerve purely as a sympathetic nerve. and it is called the deep Petrosal nerve. And this deep Petrosal nerve runs across the base of the skull, across foramen lacerum. We'll just draw in a foramen lacerum here. Foramen lacerum sits sort of about there like that. And we've got the opening of the carotid canal right here like this. Base of skull sitting there like that. And it immediately, as it crosses foramen lacerum, enters the pterygoid canal. In that pterygoid canal, it joins up with the parasympathetic fibres that have come from the greater superficial petrosal nerve. Which in the beginning have come from the seventh nerve. So this is the parasympathetic components that have joined with the sympathetic components in the pterygoid canal, right here, running along the base of the skull. In the end, these two sets of fibres at the opening of the other end of the pterygoid canal, here they are here, at the opening of the other end of the pterygoid canal, the parasympathetic and sympathetic fibres are now in the pterygopalatine fossa. And we'll talk about that area separately, other than to say that that is the key point where the second division, the maxillary division of the trigeminal nerve, will then distribute. So this is the pterygoid canal. So here you can see the sympathetic fibres that have run up the internal carotid artery. Many of them have run along the base of the skull as a very unique, purely sympathetic group of fibres called the deep petrosal nerve, run into the pterygoid canal just at the front edge of foramen lacerum to produce the nerve of the pterygoid canal. Some of you may have heard of that as Vidian's nerve, where it is those sympathetic fibres have joined up with the parasympathetic fibres of the greater superficial petrosal nerve to enter the pterygopalatine fossa.